I recorded this, I don't know, Thursday maybe, and so I've had a little bit of time to think about it since then, and I think it was a really good conversation. I think it was like a really deep and interesting conversation on like a lot of subjects. But I have to admit, on the very first subject that we talked about, um, on Marx turning Hegel on his head, and and you and Slavoj wanted to turn him back or twirl him around a little bit. I'm not totally clear. I that was actually the one part of the conversation where I kind of like the in the sort of drift of it, we ended up going to other subjects. And it was all too interested to go back to it, but it's like I didn't quite leave that part being any clearer on that, right? So we've got Russell here for the assist. What's up with the Hegel Marx thing? Which way are we turning Hegel? What does that mean?
It was interesting because I was just watching it again, and I thought at first that he was going to give the elevator pitch version of the difference, but that didn't end up that didn't end up happening. I actually thought that so let me try to navigate this a little bit. I think it was the second thing that he talked about with respect to the relation between Marx and Hegel, where he kind of he didn't really address it directly, but it was when he was talking about the function of capital, and that even though Hegel was reading Adam Smith and Ricardo, that he missed something. And even though Marx we could talk about, whether or not it's accurate, or the way in which Slavoj wants to challenge that sort of view of Marx as basically just inheriting and taking from Hegel the dialectic, but just turning it upside down, right? Mm-hmm. So that instead of beginning with ideas that then shape and help to contour and are responsible for material reality, right? As you were saying, Ben, in the when you were talking to Slavoj, right, the typical idea, or the typical way of the nice sort of visual way of framing or trying to capture what Marx did was he just took Hegel and turned him upside down, so that he maintained the dialectic, but instead we start with materialism. We start with matter and the material conditions and the mode of production under which or in which people live. That's what conditions thought. And so like a good example of that, even though it's used by Marxists, or let's say people on the left more generally, but like a good view of that, or good encapsulation of that view, would be it's a line that often gets credited to Slavoj, and he does say it a lot, but it was actually Frederick Jameson who first said it. And everyone will know this. Mark Fisher starts off capitalist realism with it, right? It's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is for us to imagine the end of capitalism. That's kind of like, it's sort of, it's a very Marxist point, but not just as far as its content is concerned, but rhetorically, because the idea there would be, and it's in the sort of formula, would be that because of the mode of production that we're in, like, it's stymieing our ability to think outside of it, right? So that's really an effect of material conditions, sort of conditioning what we can, providing some sort of limit of where thought can go. All right. So if you want the sort of quick elevator answer, or want to look for where Slavoj is very sort of specific about the difference between Marx and Hegel, a good place to go, I think the best place to go, is one of his early books. And I think it's one of his most important books. It's very theoretically dense. It's one of the more challenging, like, abstract philosophical books. But it's an early one from 1993 called Tarrying with the Negative. Mm-hmm. And the subtitle of that is Kant, Hegel, and the Critique of Ideology. And in that, he says, I think it is in the very first chapter, after over a century of the Marxian overturning of Hegel, turning Hegel upside down, maybe it's time to turn Hegel right side up. And I don't want to go on too long here, but I'll pause in a second. But in the second thing that he said to you when he was talking about how Hegel Hegel was not Hegelian enough, which is a formulation that he likes to use. Like, thinker betrays his or her own thinking by not following it to the end. When he says that Hegel should have seen what Marx saw, which is that the dialectical move whereby labor itself becomes the greatest, becomes like the sort of zero level of the commodity, like the best example of the commodity under capitalism, labor itself. And so that's part of a larger sort of reimagining of the dialectic that Slavoj has been working on for over 30 years now. Like, the standard view is, and this is how I was taught it, and then I had to be sort of untaught it, was that the dialectic proceeds according to thesis, antithesis, right? You have these two diametrically opposed entities, good and evil, right and wrong, and that there's a clash, which is a mediation between the two, and then they're ultimately sublated or synthesized or reconciled into something higher, right? But you won't find that thesis, antithesis, synthesis anywhere in Hegel. It's a sort of retroactive, invention that then gets, which is how, again, I was taught this in graduate school. That's how I was initially taught Hegel. But the point here is about the dialectic that Slavoj is arguing, is that the antithesis, or what appears to be the opposite of a given social structure, form, a thesis, is actually internal to the thesis itself. And so, which is why when he says that, labor becomes the ultimate, what is used to produce commodities becomes itself the ultimate commodity. That's what he was saying, like with a dialectical twist there. So I think his point would be that by no means is he, he considers himself a Marxist, but Marx would be sort of third in importance in figures. It would be Hegel, the psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan, and then Marx. But the first chapter of his, first book, Sublime Object of Ideology, the first book in English, is all about Marx and how Marx's notion of surplus value sort of grounds the psychoanalytic notion of surplus enjoyment and so on. So I don't want to go too far afield, but basically, I think his argument would be that you don't have that sort of understanding of the dialectic in Marx that you do in Hegel. So I think that he would say that in Marx envisions a sort of overcoming of this antagonism, or a final sort of synthesis, which would be like the proletarian revolution, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat would be, and you could argue whether or not this is a Marxist position or not, but his position would be that is the Marxist, like socialism, like the dictatorship of the proletariat, according to traditional Marxism, would be a sort of overcoming of antagonism and of class conflict. But in the way he reads Hegel, there is no overcoming of antagonism, which doesn't mean that society can't improve or can't get better. But I think that wasn't very succinct, but I think that kind of gets to the core of what, whenever he talks about why he prioritizes Hegel over Marx, this idea of antagonism or contradiction being, and now we're getting really abstract, being non-identical to itself. So I don't know if hopefully that helps a little bit, but if people are interested, go and take a look at, what he says in that first chapter. There's also a very good piece, I think it's in a collection called Zizek Now, by a friend of mine, Todd McGowan, and I think it's something like Zizek's Hegelian Marx or something. But it's so there is stuff on it, but like you said, he's written whole books on the subject. So
yeah, so a fair encapsulation of that maybe is that when people are talking about Marx turning Hegel on his head, the idea is that the sort of the methodological structure is the same, but that Hegel has this view about history, about the talk the way you just said it, the movement of the dialectic, whatever, that puts non-material factors first. There's the people talk about ideas or like the, I mean, if you actually read Hegel, maybe, the world spirit coming into a being or whatever, right? But like some kind of non-material stuff is coming first, and Marx is turning around and keeping the methodological structure, but wants to say material factors are sort of coming first. There's, development of the forces of production, the relations of production, like your example about, capitalism being, so firmly entrenched that we can't imagine anything except outside of it. But what Slavoj is getting at about the turning Hegel back isn't really about that difference at all. It's
Right.
about how to think about the methodology itself, that like how to think about how dialectics work.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't think that he would even say that this is true of Marx generally. Like I don't like in other words, I don't think he would say Marx is incapable of thinking that. He gave you a good example of where, Marx is thinking more dialectically than Hegel was in that instance of like, labor becoming the sort of capitalist commodity, or the sort of definition of a commodity under capitalism. But it's also there, and Ben, I think you and I have talked about this before. Maybe it was when we were doing like the Peterson, the Zizek Peterson debate breakdown, but it's there. It is there in Marx too, because it's not as though in Marx, it's not as though bourgeois and proletariat are. I think you can actually interpret Marx in the way that I was, talking about the Slavoj's interpretation of the dialectic in Hegel. It's that, Marx very specifically said, I mean, it's not just in the manifesto, but it's also in, Grundrisse, and it's in Capital, in very different manifestations or different articulations, but that it's not that you have bourgeois versus proletariat and it's like, one entity versus other. It is the bourgeois capitalist mode of production, and the proletariat is like the sort of surplus excrement really that gets generated by it, which is why he says it's not under, the old form of class divide where there is very little social mobility, like upward or downward, right? He says, Marx just keeps saying that capitalism creates its own, it digs its own grave. It creates so the proletariat is a byproduct of capitalism. So it's the inherent antagonism within the system itself. So in that regard, there's a way in which I think he wants to turn Hegel around, or turn challenge this common notion of, this is Hegel's idealism, this is Marx's materialism, and say that actually, in a way, like to reactualize Marx in a more modern way would require this sort of this version of the Hegelian dialectic, this particular interpretation of it.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.